Our children, Archie and Lily, are just 6 and 4 years old. Can you believe it?
The palace believed the silence was permanent. They believed the distance was controlled. Then the phone rang. It was not a routine call, and it was not meant for negotiation. What came through that line carried urgency, consequence, and a warning that could not be unheard. In that instant, carefully maintained assumptions collapsed, and the institution realized it was no longer ahead of the story. The call that broke the silence. The call came just after dawn at a moment when the palace believed the day would unfold like so many others before it. Briefings were being reviewed. Overnight media summaries were already marked and set aside. Nothing on the schedule suggested disruption. Then the secure line rang. It was not scheduled. It was not routed through legal counsel. It did not come from a diplomatic office or a trusted intermediary. The name that appeared on the internal screen froze the room. Meghan. For a split second, no one moved. In an institution trained to anticipate every possible scenario, this was not one of them. The palace had grown accustomed to distance, to silence, to carefully manage separation. This call cut through all of that. The receiver was lifted. The door was quietly closed. Notes were taken by hand, not digitally. Within moments, senior staff were alerted without explanation, only urgency. From the first words spoken, it was clear this was not a courtesy call. Meghan was calm but not tentative, controlled but unmistakably serious. She did not ask how anyone was. She did not reference the past. She did not open with emotion. She opened with a warning. Those listening understood immediately that this was not about reconciliation or grievance. This was about timing, about something already in motion, about consequences that could no longer be delayed or managed quietly. The atmosphere inside the room shifted from curiosity to gravity, the kind that settles when people realize a line has already been crossed, whether acknowledged or not. What unsettled the palace most was the absence of dramatics. There was no anger to dismiss, no tears to reframe, no escalation to label as instability. Meghan spoke with precision. Each sentence carried intent. Each pause suggested calculation, not uncertainty. She was not asking for intervention. She was informing them of the risk. As the call continued, aides exchanged glances without speaking. One began marking timestamps. Another reached for a second folder that had not been touched in weeks. A third quietly left the room to alert someone higher up the chain without waiting for permission. The palace has heard many difficult calls over decades. Crises, scandals, collapses. What made this one different was the direction of pressure. This time the institution was not reacting to the press. It was reacting to the person it believed was already contained. When the call ended, no one spoke right away. The silence that followed was heavier than the conversation itself. It was the silence of recalculation, of realizing that assumptions made months earlier were no longer safe. One senior aide finally broke it with a single sentence, spoken quietly but firmly. This changes the timeline. Within minutes, protocols shifted. Briefings were halted. Communication staff were told to stand by without explanation. Legal advisors were quietly contacted, not to prepare statements, but to assess exposure because whatever Meghan had just said, it had done something the palace could not undo. It had placed responsibility back inside those walls. And once that happens, the story is no longer about distance. It becomes about what the palace chooses to do next. Why she called now? To understand why Meghan made that call when she did, it is necessary to look beyond the appearance of calm that had settled around her public image in recent months. From the outside, it seemed as though the long chapter of tension had closed. There were fewer statements, fewer confrontations, a sense that distance had become permanent and therefore manageable. Inside that quiet, something else was building. For weeks, Meghan had been receiving signals that were subtle enough to escape public notice, but unmistakable to someone who had learned how institutional silence works. Messages were acknowledged without substance. Assurances were delivered without follow-through. Conversations that once moved quickly now stalled in process. None of it was overtly hostile. That was the point. Detachment is how institutions prepare themselves. It creates plausible distance. It allows outcomes to unfold without fingerprints, and Meghan recognized that pattern immediately. What troubled her most was not what was being said. It was what was no longer being corrected. In recent days, a shift in tone had begun to appear across multiple platforms. Not through dramatic headlines, but through careful framing. Language that softened responsibility. Phrases that implied inevitability rather than choice. Stories that stopped short of accusation but left just enough space for assumption to harden. To the casual observer, it looked like routine commentary. To Meghan, it looked like the early stage of narrative transfer, the moment when accountability quietly moves from institution to individual. She had lived through that before. This time, however, the stakes were higher. What was forming was not just a media narrative, but a convergence of legal, reputational, and security concerns that were beginning to overlap. Each on its own might have been manageable. Together, they created a situation where timing mattered more than intention. Waiting carried risk. There were also external pressures the public never sees. Third parties whose interests do not align neatly with palace restraint. Advisors who calculate exposure in days rather than years. Media ecosystems that reward escalation over accuracy. Meghan understood that once these forces align, the window for quiet correction closes quickly. That was the first reason she called. The second reason was more personal and far more decisive. For a long time, Meghan had carried the expectation that if she remained silent, the institution would act with proportional care, that certain lines would not be crossed, that some form of internal awareness would act as a brake even in the absence of public defense. Recently, that confidence has eroded. It was not one moment, but a series of small realizations. Did not happen. A clarification that was never issued. A decision that appeared to move forward despite unresolved concerns. The message was not spoken, but it was clear. The institution was protecting itself first, and in doing so, it was preparing to let the consequences fall elsewhere. Meghan also knew something else the palace could not afford to overlook. Silence no longer protected her. It protected everyone else. Every day, she said nothing. Assumptions filled the space. Each delay made it easier for others to claim ignorance later. The longer she waited, the harder it would be to demonstrate that warnings had been given. The call was not an emotional reaction. It was a strategic decision. By calling directly, she bypassed the filters that slow information until it loses urgency. She created a record that could not be dismissed as rumor or interpretation. She ensured that specific people heard specific concerns at a specific moment in time. That matters in institutions built on documentation and precedent. She was also clear about one final point, though it was not stated outright. She would not carry what came next alone. For years, the expectation had been that she would absorb fallout quietly, that she would allow narratives to run their course while she remained a distant figure, disconnected and therefore easy to frame. That expectation no longer held. Meghan was not threatening exposure. She was establishing shared awareness, a subtle but profound difference. If events unfolded as she believed they might, there would be no question about who had been informed and when. The palace would not be able to claim surprise or lack of knowledge. That was the moment the balance shifted. The call was not about reopening old wounds or revisiting past grievances. It was about preventing future damage that could not be undone once public. And perhaps most importantly, it was about reclaiming agency. By calling when she did, Meghan moved herself from the margins of a story back into its center. Not as a subject to be discussed, but as an actor shaping what came next. She understood that the palace responds differently when it knows it is being watched by history, not headlines. That understanding is why the call happened when it did, not later, not after confirmation, not once damage was visible. Now, because in moments like this, timing is not everything. It is the only thing inside the palace response. The palace response did not arrive with raised voices or visible panic. It arrived in silence, in stillness, in the subtle but immediate reordering of priorities. When the call ended, there was no rush to issue statements or consult outside voices. The first instinct was containment. Information was narrowed, not expanded. Only a small circle was briefed, chosen not for rank alone, but for discretion and institutional memory. Those brought into the room understood the significance instantly. This was not treated as a personal matter or a public relations concern. It was framed as a structural risk. The language used internally reflected that shift. Words like narrative and optics were replaced with responsibility and exposure. That change alone signaled how seriously the warning was taken. Every detail of the call was reconstructed. Not just what Meghan said, but how she said it. The pauses were noted. The order of points mattered. The fact that she did not ask for reassurance was discussed at length. In palace culture, that absence is louder than demand. It suggested certainty rather than speculation. One of the first actions taken was procedural review. Ongoing plans were quietly paused without explanation. Drafts that had been circulating were pulled back for reassessment. Advisors were asked to identify decisions that had been made under assumptions that might no longer hold. Nothing was cancelled outright, but everything was questioned. Legal counsel was consulted early, not to prepare defense, but to assess vulnerability. The question was not what could be denied, but what could be proven. Documentation was reviewed, timelines were checked, who knew what and when became a central concern. In institutions that survive on precedent, records are both shield and liability. Security teams were looped in next, not because of an immediate threat, but because of potential escalation. The palace understands how quickly situations can move once external forces become aware of internal hesitation. The goal was to avoid being reactive. That required anticipating how others might interpret silence or delay. Communication staff were given unusually restrained instructions. No proactive engagement, no background briefings, no corrective leaks. This was a notable departure from normal practice. It reflected uncertainty rather than confidence. When an institution is sure of its footing, it speaks quietly but clearly. When it is reassessing, it waits. Behind closed doors, the tone shifted further. There was acknowledgement that the palace had underestimated the moment. Not the person, but the timing. Meghan had chosen a point when multiple pressures were converging, when margins for error were already thin. That reality made the warning harder to dismiss. What unsettled senior figures most was the clarity of implication. Meghan had not issued ultimatums. She had not demanded action. Yet the message was unmistakable. If the institution failed to adjust, it would own the outcome. That placed responsibility back where it is least comfortable, inside decision-making rooms rather than press offices. There was also a recognition that the power dynamic had changed. For years, the palace operated under the assumption that distance equaled control. Silence was treated as containment. The call disrupted that logic. It demonstrated that absence does not mean disengagement and that information can move in ways the institution does not command. As hours passed, the initial response solidified into recalibration. Plans were redrawn with more contingencies. Risk assessments were updated. Advisors who had previously been peripheral were brought closer. Others found their influence reduced. This was not announced. It was felt internally. The question shifted from whether the palace should respond to how it could avoid missteps. The emphasis moved from message to mechanism. How decisions were made mattered more than how they would be explained. That is a rare but telling pivot. By the end of the day, nothing visible had changed to the outside world. There were no leaks, no statements, no signals that anything was amiss. But within the palace, the atmosphere was different. There was awareness that a line had been crossed. Not by Meghan, but by time itself. The institution now carried knowledge it could not unknow. And with that knowledge came obligation. What it chose to do next would not simply shape headlines. It would define responsibility. And that realization lingered long after the phone went quiet. What Meghan said that changed everything. Meghan did not begin the call by recounting the past. There was no catalog of grievances, no attempt to revisit old disputes or reopen wounds that had already hardened. From the outset, she made it clear that this conversation was not about what had been done to her. It was about what was about to happen if certain paths continued unchecked. Her tone was steady and deliberate. Those listening later described it as controlled but resolute. There was no rush in her words, no emotional surge that could be dismissed as reaction. Instead, she spoke with the precision of someone who understood the consequences of every sentence. She outlined developments that were already in motion, not rumors or suspicions, but patterns she had observed forming across legal, media, and advisory spaces. She did not claim certainty, but she demonstrated awareness. That distinction mattered. It signaled that this was not speculation, but informed concern. What unsettled the palace most was the way she framed responsibility. Meghan did not accuse the institution of intent. She did not suggest malice or conspiracy. Instead, she described how inaction and delay could produce outcomes that would appear intentional once exposed. In other words, she warned that silence could be misread as consent. That reframing shifted the weight of the conversation. It placed accountability not on past behavior, but on future choice. The palace was no longer being asked to defend itself. It was being asked to decide what it would allow to unfold. She also made clear that time was not a neutral factor. Every day, without clarification, increased risk. Each moment of hesitation created space for assumptions to solidify. She spoke of momentum as something that once gained becomes difficult to stop. That understanding resonated with those listening. They knew how quickly narratives become fixed once they escape internal control. Perhaps the most significant part of the call came when Meghan addressed the idea of burden. Without naming it directly, she communicated that she would no longer carry the weight of consequences created by decisions made without her input. This was not presented as a threat. It was stated as a boundary. She explained that she had done what was expected of her for years. She had remained quiet. She had stepped back. She had allowed others to manage the narrative. But the conditions that made that possible no longer existed. Silence, she said, was no longer protective. It was harmful. That statement landed heavily. In palace culture, restraint is often interpreted as compliance. Meghan disrupted that assumption. She clarified that restraint has limits, and that those limits had been reached not through conflict, but through accumulation. Small choices compounded over time until they produced an untenable situation. She also addressed a misunderstanding that had shaped internal thinking, the belief that distance meant disengagement. Meghan corrected that quietly but firmly. She made it clear that stepping away did not mean ignorance. That absence did not equal disinterest. She had been watching, listening, and understanding far more than the palace realized. This revelation forced a recalibration. It suggested that the institution had been operating on outdated assumptions about where she stood and what she knew. That alone altered the dynamic of the call. Toward the end of the conversation, Meghan articulated what she was not asking for. She did not want public statements in her defense. She did not seek reconciliation gestures. She did not request special treatment. What she wanted was awareness and responsibility. She wanted the palace to understand that if events unfolded in certain ways, it would not be accurate to portray them as unforeseen. She was creating a record, not for leverage, but for truth. The final moments of the call were quiet. There was no dramatic closing line, no emotional appeal. She simply reiterated that she had done what she believed was necessary and that what came next would depend on choices made inside those walls. When the call ended, those listening understood that something fundamental had shifted. Meghan had not changed the past. She had changed the frame through which the future would be judged. That is what made the call impossible to ignore. It did not demand action. It demanded accountability. The fallout already underway. The effects of the call did not announce themselves loudly. There were no sudden headlines, no dramatic reversals, no public acknowledgments that anything had changed. Yet within hours, the atmosphere surrounding the palace and its extended network began to shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to those accustomed to reading between the lines. One of the first signs appeared in what did not happen. Planned conversations were delayed. Briefings that had been expected were quietly postponed. Media inquiries that might normally have received carefully calibrated responses were met with polite silence. This pause was not indecisive. It was a recalculation. Behind closed doors, advisors began reassessing positions that had previously seemed settled. Language that once felt firm was softened. Assumptions that had guided strategy were no longer treated as reliable. The call had introduced a variable that could not be ignored, and that alone forced a reevaluation of risk within the communication sphere. The shift was particularly noticeable. Long-standing media partners sensed hesitation. The usual rhythm of background guidance slowed. Sources who had once spoken with confidence became cautious. In an ecosystem built on predictability, that hesitation signaled internal uncertainty. The palace also began to examine how quickly information might travel beyond its control. Meghan had demonstrated that she was both informed and attentive. That awareness raised questions about who else might be watching and what conclusions they might draw from continued silence. The institution has always understood the danger of appearing reactive. Now it faced the equal danger of appearing willfully unaware. Legal considerations moved closer to the center of discussion. Advisors revisited documentation and decision trails, not because they anticipated immediate challenge, but because they recognized how narratives harden once scrutiny begins. The focus shifted from what could be explained to what could be substantiated. That distinction mattered. Security teams monitored external developments more closely, not because of a direct threat, but because of the potential for escalation once narratives intersect with public emotion. The palace understands that moments of uncertainty can attract attention from actors with their own agendas. Caution became the default posture. What made the fallout particularly complex was that it unfolded without a clear end point. There was no single decision to reverse, no statement to issue that would resolve the tension. Instead, the institution found itself navigating a series of smaller choices, each carrying weight. Speak or remain silent. Clarify or defer. Act now or wait. Each choice now carried a different calculus. Internally, there was acknowledgement that the call had altered how Meghan was perceived. She was no longer seen primarily as a distant figure whose relevance diminished with time. She was understood as someone who remained engaged, informed, and capable of influencing outcomes without public confrontation. That realization forced a reconsideration of strategy. Distance alone was no longer sufficient. Silence was no longer neutral. The palace had to account for the possibility that inaction could be interpreted as disregard. Outside the palace, the ripple effects were equally telling. Commentators who typically spoke with certainty began to hedge. Narratives that had been gaining traction stalled or shifted tone. The absence of reinforcement created space for alternative interpretations. In some cases, stories simply lost momentum. This was not a coincidence. When institutions hesitate, ecosystems notice. The media may not know why, but it senses when confidence falters. That subtle change influences coverage even without explicit direction. The fallout also reached advisors and allies who operate on the periphery of palace influence. Conversations grew more guarded. Assumptions were questioned. Some began preparing for outcomes they had previously dismissed as unlikely. What emerged was a kind of collective pause. No one wanted to move too quickly. No one wanted to be wrong. In that pause, the power dynamic continued to shift. Meghan had not issued a public statement. She had not escalated. Yet, her influence was felt through the decisions others now hesitated to make. That is often how real leverage works. The palace found itself in an unfamiliar position. Instead of shaping the narrative, it was managing potential accountability. Instead of projecting certainty, it was weighing consequences. This did not mean weakness, but it did mean vulnerability. As days passed, the absence of outward change became its own signal. Observers began to note the quiet. The lack of clarity invited speculation, but it also prevented closure. Without resolution, attention lingered. Internally, some argued for decisive action. Others urged restraint. The debate was not about whether the call mattered. That was no longer in question. The debate was about how to respond without compounding risk. Every option carried trade-offs. Addressing the issue publicly could validate concerns and draw attention to matters best left unexamined. Remaining silent could allow narratives to form unchecked. Acting privately risked leaks. Doing nothing risked being seen as indifferent. In this environment, even routine decisions took on new significance. Timing was scrutinized. Language was parsed. The margin for error narrowed. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of the fallout was the shift in perception. Meghan was no longer positioned as someone reacting to events shaped by others. She was understood as someone capable of influencing the environment through awareness and timing alone. That change did not require public acknowledgement to be effective. It altered how the palace thought about future interactions. It introduced caution where confidence had once existed. It reminded the institution that distance does not equal disengagement and that silence does not always serve those who rely on it. By the time the full weight of the call was absorbed, one thing was clear. The fallout was not a moment. It was a process, and it was already underway. Nothing goes back after this. There are moments inside institutions when time splits into before and after. They are rarely announced. They do not arrive with ceremony or public acknowledgement. They reveal themselves slowly through altered behavior, cautious language, and decisions that feel heavier than they once did. This was one of those moments. After the call, the palace could not return to its previous assumptions. The belief that distance equaled closure no longer held. The idea that silence could neutralize complexity had been quietly dismantled. What remained was awareness, and awareness carries obligation. The most significant change was not procedural. It was psychological. The institution now understood that Meghan was not a static figure in its past, but an active presence in its future. Not because she sought to be, but because circumstances had aligned in a way that made disengagement impossible. She had demonstrated that she knew when to speak and how to be heard. That knowledge reshaped every calculation that followed. Decisions that once felt routine were now examined for implication. Advisors asked different questions. Not just how something would look, but how it would be interpreted later. Not just whether a risk was manageable, but whether it was defensible. The lens had shifted from optics to record. This is where institutions feel the most pressure. Not from outrage or confrontation, but from history. The awareness that choices will one day be reviewed not in real time, but in hindsight. That awareness changes behavior. The palace also faced an uncomfortable truth. By not acting sooner, it had allowed a gap to form between intention and outcome. That gap is where narratives grow. It is where accountability becomes blurred. Meghan had illuminated that gap without dramatizing it, and that made it impossible to ignore. What followed was not reconciliation. It was not a confrontation. It was something quieter and more enduring, a recalibration of boundaries. The palace did not suddenly embrace transparency. Institutions rarely do, but it became more cautious about assuming control. It recognized that not all influence is visible, and not all power announces itself. Meghan had exercised influence simply by being precise, timely, and documented. That realization lingered internally. There was acknowledgement that this moment would shape future interactions, not just with Meghan, but with anyone who had once been positioned at a distance. The call served as a reminder that absence does not erase involvement, and that people who step back are often still paying attention. There was also a shift in how silence was used. Previously, it had been a default response. Now, it was treated as a choice that required justification. Silence could still be strategic, but it was no longer neutral. Every pause carried meaning. This change extended beyond immediate circumstances. It influenced how advisors framed risk. Across the board, it encouraged earlier intervention rather than delayed reaction. It reminded decision-makers that warnings are not always loud and that the quiet ones are often the most consequential. For Meghan, the call marked a different kind of boundary. She had not reclaimed a role within the institution. She had not sought validation or permission. What she reclaimed was agency. By speaking when she did, she ensured that her perspective was part of the record, not as commentary but as context. That distinction matters. Context shapes judgment long after headlines fade. The call also altered how responsibility would be distributed going forward. No single outcome could now be framed as unforeseen. No development could be explained away as surprising. Awareness had been established, and with its shared responsibility. That is why nothing goes back after this. Not because of conflict, but because of clarity. Institutions can absorb criticism. They can withstand scandal. What they struggle with is accountability that arrives before the damage is done. It removes the option of plausible distance. It demands intention. The palace now operated under that constraint. What happens next will unfold quietly, as most institutional shifts do, through policy. Rather than proclamation, through caution rather than confidence, through choices that reveal themselves only when compared to what might have been done before. But those watching closely will notice. They will see the hesitation where certainty once lived, the restraint where assumption once ruled, the awareness that someone outside the walls is paying attention and that their attention matters. This is not the end of a story. It is the end of an illusion. The illusion that silence resolves complexity. The illusion that distance eliminates responsibility. The illusion that power flows only one way. After this moment, the palace knows better. And so does Meghan. Nothing returns to what it was before, because what was before depended on not knowing. Now they know. And knowledge changes everything. What happens next will not be announced loudly, but it will shape everything that follows. If you want to understand these moments before they surface publicly, stay here. Subscribe for deeper context, careful analysis, and the stories that unfold behind closed doors. In times like this, silence is never empty, and awareness is the only advantage that lasts.